episode of the BioHub. Today, we're thrilled to have Dr. Arjun Goyal. Arjun is the co-founder and managing director of Vida Ventures, a leading life science venture capital firm with approximately $2 billion under management. He serves on the boards of companies like Scorpion Therapeutics and Quanta Therapeutics, and has played key roles in several high-profile investments and acquisitions. Today, we'll dive into Arjun's journey from physician to investor, the story behind Vida Ventures, and what they look for in executives and new company investments. He'll also share insights into current market trends, his decision-making processes, and what sets his mindset apart. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Arjun Goyal. Pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Max. And it's great to be here and be a part of BioHub.
Amazing. So, just to start us off, Arjun, can you share your journey from being a physician to becoming a venture capitalist, and also what motivated you to do it?
Thanks, definitely, Max. So the transition from physician to venture capital, for me, it wasn't a straight line or deliberate, set of steps. It wasn't, part of any, big planning on my part. What it's always been is where can I be most effective in terms of impact on patients and patient care. It's been the overarching sort of motivation driver for me since I was a medical student. And I was lucky in that I came from a medical family. My dad is a physician. My twin brother, is a physician. I grew up in an environment where the accent, the emphasis was on really two things. A really sort of technical, solid science based education, as well as values where you could do good by others, or good to others. And so those were the overarching themes of my childhood, which I'm very thankful to my parents, uh, and the decision to be a doctor was a natural one for me. What wasn't natural was what path that would take. As I mentioned, the goal was to see where I could have the most impact. Um, and as I went through medical school, I again got quite lucky because I was in a program in Australia. I'm from Australia originally. So I was in a program in Australia where there was an emphasis just not on clinical medicine, but also on research. And so it was, obligatory for every medical student to do a year, to do a year of research. Um, and So I did my year of research in global health and vaccine research. It was a great year for me because I got to go overseas. Went over to the UK, to the University of Oxford, and was at the Wellcome Trust Center for Human Genetics with Professor Adrian Hill. Uh, that group is now, you know, famous for the role they played in the development of the COVID vaccine,
Mm-hmm.
which is subsequently commercialized. But back in 2000 and 2003, it was a leading group in vaccine research, T cell based vaccine research for a whole host of pathogens, and my research was focused on malaria. And so I got to spend 12 months in the UK, at the Wellcome Trust Center for Human Genetics, um, in a world leading lab, and exposed to not just bench work, but also to translational work, and also to actual clinical trials. So what was unique about Adrian's group was they did everything, true bench to bedside model of care,
Mm-hmm.
and that really allowed you to see the impact you could have, um, as a group, as a research group, with trial subjects and patients in this case in Africa, working on candidate vaccines in a lab in the UK. And that sort of sowed the seed of what I wanted my career to be, which was, at the cutting edge of research and clinical practice, um, uh, and also with a focus on new therapies, experimental medicine. Uh, Beyond that, the sort of the path had to be defined, but at such a young young age, impressionable age, I think I really did get lucky working with a great investigator, and seeing bench to bedside model of care of research and clinical practice. I went back to the University of Melbourne to complete my medical studies, and then worked as a doctor, intern and resident in back in Sydney, my hometown. Again, with the kernel of where can I combine these interests in research, medicine, experimental medicine, and orientated towards oncology, and as a great sort of specialty where you could do that, at least in the Australian context. And so started my clinical training in Australia, went back to the UK, this time to Cambridge, where I did a postgraduate studies, in in cancer biology. Did a program as well that was focused on biotech and the commercialization of biotech.
Nice.
Um, and being back in that sort of ecosystem, uh, where even more so today, but certainly back then, there was discussion of starting companies, raising money, various competitions to enable that. I really sort of jumped into that ecosystem, and started a company. Actually, started a company there called Foresight Pharmaceuticals, based on some research from my alma mater in Melbourne, and a tremendous researcher, investigator, and personal mentor, Professor Roger Short. And if I was to describe to you the insight and the invention, and you would say today, like you bet your career on this, but that's the beauty of biotech. It needs some dreams. So what we did was put together a company based on Professor Roger Short's insight that the application of estriol to the uh, to the topical foreskin of monkeys, so simian macaques, uh, keratinizes or thickens that foreskin, and that acts as a physical barrier against the transmission of STIs,
Oh
sexually
wow.
transmitted infections, most notably SIV, which is semen immunodeficiency virus, the HIV analog in monkeys. And so Roger had shown this pretty conclusively. It was actually published work subsequent, and we had IP patents that we had filed. The University of Melbourne had filed, but then we had taken on and prosecuted as a company globally. And so, I wrote a business plan around that concept, with the applications, twofold. One is the consumer setting, and that is as a coating for condoms. And the second is as a standalone gel for human application. And so,
Well,
so that's really how I got into this business. Is that I wrote a business plan on that as a student in the UK, Cambridge, after having trained in medicine
what a story.
and oncology. Um, and funnily enough, we got a bit of money, and started running, some basic formulation work.
Hmm.
Formulation work to see how this could be formulated as a gel. This could be formulated as a coating for condoms, I that's how at least my career today in biotech, that's how it really started. Uh, and I, through that process, which is a multi-year process, I learned a few things, or at least became aware of a few things. I became aware that capital and their need to raise capital is so central to success or failure.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. The second was, working with world class scientists and having a very clear product concept is incredibly important, because the value is ultimately in the product. The science or the technology is the enabler, but the value is in the product. And the third thing I learned was that IP is incredibly valuable, and I learned those three lessons. I would say the hard way. Um, but I that's so I started this company with those lessons in mind. I actually came here to the U.S. I'm now based in Boston, but came here to the U.S. Worked on the startup, raised some more money. We had a weak IP position, and so whilst we did do some deals, more on the consumer health side, it wasn't really the basis for being a real company. But I caught the biotech bug, so I completed my. I started an MBA here in Boston at Harvard Business School, and I felt that let me give this a year or two, see how it goes. I was still working on foresight at the time,
Okay.
and if it didn't work out, then that's great. I'm still a doctor. Could go back to Australia, and be a sensible doctor, and lead a sensible life. But if it worked out, then great. Let's make it happen. So that's the attitude I took, and joined a venture group called 5am Ventures, and that was really my apprenticeship in the business from business school. The other germane aspect of the business school story was I met my now co-founder and business partner Stefan Vitarovich, who was a classmate at business school at HBS. He was a Stanford science undergrad who'd worked in healthcare banking and then in private equity. And he joined Third Rock Ventures post business school. I
Okay.
joined 5 and then in 2016 we got together and as two of four co-founders at Vida Ventures and helped put Vida together. Uh, but I would say taking a step back, uh, you know, today in my career in venture capital, I believe that sort of the overarching, motivation, which was always, where you could have the most patient impact. Um, that's where, I feel with my skill set, my background, I can have. So the underlying, motivation, what drives me, that hasn't changed in 20 odd years. It's just the setting has changed, and what I do has changed. But I, feel incredibly, thankful and excited to be able to do what I do here.
Yeah, amazing. I was just thinking then as well what I could title this podcast as, from condoms to venture capitalist or yeah. I wouldn't do anything like that. But let's talk about Vida
You're-
Ventures.
Sure.
So you obviously co-founded the firm with the gentleman you just mentioned as well. Since its inception, how's it evolved, and what's happened since?
Yeah, absolutely. So, two chapters: the founding chapter and where we are today at Vito. The founding chapter, you know, I want to acknowledge, contributions and the founding stories, if you like, of not just Stefan Vitarovich, who's a Vita co-founder and still a key driver here at Vita, but also Ari Beltegren, who was a Vita co-founder, still very active, here at Vita,
Hmm.
and Fred Cohen, who was also a Vita co-founder, and basically we got together in 2016. Fred had been at TPG Biotech, was close to Stefan. Ari, who was certainly a very well known biotech entrepreneur at the time. This is before the Kite exit, but was an operator, entrepreneur, and academic, and Stefan and me, who were at the Rock and 5M respectively, and we came together, with the backing and foresight of one or two other groups, capital providers, with the aim to do the following, and really that was as follows. The first was to put together, uh, therapeutics focus, investment group that could be active across the stage of development opportunities.
Hmm.
And I'll explain each. So that was the first. The second was to really focus on groundbreaking science and technology. So really to assume those risks. Um, in newer modalities, modalities like cell and gene therapy, where we saw transformational patient impact. That was the second, and the third was to offer you know a different way to do business, right? And so our view was that venture had been pretty clubby, almost pseudo oligopolies, club deals. We was never really part of that club, never aspired to be part of that club. What we wanted to do was be company friendly, entrepreneur friendly, and work with entrepreneurs and companies through the spectrum of value creation, being capital providers right through that spectrum as their needs changed. So those were the three tenants, the founding tenants of Vida, and I'll talk through each of them and why at that point in time they were we felt that they were pretty unique.
Hmm.
The first was being a stage agnostic. Investment group. And I would say the context is that the industry has evolved since then, but back then, groups were put in buckets. Either you were early stage firm, or you were a late stage firm, or you were a public firm. We felt that if we put together a world class team that could underwrite the science, then it didn't necessarily matter which part of the spectrum you played. Early, mid, crossover. It was a different risk reward, but the technical underwriting, the ability to assess the probability of success of of an asset, or even a platform, you know, that team that could do that remained the same irrespective of the stage of opportunity. And so it meant that we could play across the spectrum and not constrict ourselves. Um, um, and say no to companies or no to entrepreneurs just because they weren't early stage or they weren't late stage, depending on our strategy. So basically, we could tap into a broader, universe of opportunities. So that was the first. I have to say the market has evolved, and now you're finding a number of groups doing that either through one fund or multiple funds. But back then that wasn't the case. Uh, uh, the second was, this concept of, entrepreneur friendliness. And I want to make it clear, it's not to say that our peers are not entrepreneur friendly. They certainly are entrepreneur friendly. But we felt that the founding group here were both investors and operators, and that the team that we subsequently put together were investors and operators,
Hmm.
or are investors and operators. And so we could basically, have a bit more, empathy and a bit more credibility with our CEOs and our companies, because the sort of the perspective we provided was not a pure play investor perspective, or it was overlaid with the lens of having been there and done it, and that that would be a helpful perspective for these companies. Um, uh, I would so those that's just sort of more sort of color to sort of the founding principles of Vita. Fast forward to today, we're very proud of what the group, is in the process of building. And that is, we're staying true to those values, true to the tenants. We put together a wonderful team of senior associates, fellows, venture partners, operating partners, and CEOs. Uh, We've invested in close to 40 companies over the last several years. We have about 30 active companies in our portfolio from multiple IPOs, multiple exits, raised, as you mentioned, close to 2 billion across a couple of funds. So the numbers, speak to the, to the hard work, great determination of Vida's team at large. But we also realize that it's still early days. Biotech, venture capital and biotech product development, timelines are what they are, and so for us, what we want to ultimately judge ourselves is by, medicines approved, by our portfolio companies in partnership with Pharma, um, and of course, making sure that we do well by our by our own limited partners, the groups that have given us capital, and to be stewards of that capital through outsized returns.
Yeah. I obviously as a recruiter talk to so many small company, mid-sized companies, and I suppose a common theme over the last at least year, probably last 2 years, is that companies have struggled for fundraising. At Vida, has the market changed your strategy in any way, or not really?
Yeah. So it's a good question, Max. And I would answer it as follows. So, the context setting is that Vida, by design, we've always been stage agnostic. So we've always looked to construct a portfolio of early stage opportunities and then some, later stage opportunities.
Yeah.
It just happens where we are in the third fund is that you know we have made many of those early stage bets, if you like, investments, either through putting those companies together ourselves, or through getting into syndicated deals, and so we're looking for some later stage companies to round out the fund, more sort of asset centric clinical stage plays. That's just where we happen to be, from a portfolio construction perspective in our third fund. Uh, as I look at the landscape of opportunities that we're looking at, we see a lot of compelling opportunities on the early stage side, and also on the late stage side, from a science and even valuation perspective. So I think it's really a great sort of stock picker, company picker market, and I think that's going to continue to be the case because the, there is still I would say uh, uh, the headwinds of the last 2 3 years from a cost of capital change, so from a macro perspective, and that macro perspective is really cost of capital, interest rates, and sentiment. um, um, you know the headwinds from that of the last 2 3 years, as well as frankly the public markets being shut, and a rebasing of valuation on the public sides, rebasing valuation on the private sides, and
Hmm.
private valuations like public valuations. I think that's still working its way through the system, and so that's why the volume of financings, on the private side, has been less than what it was in the COVID times. My own view on that is, the COVID sort of era was a blip, and so that was an unsustainable pace, of financings, and many incremental companies were being financed, which is not good for the overall health of the industry. I think we're getting to something which is a bit more sustainable, and approaching pre-COVID levels, which is good companies with good science and clear products are getting financed, and the volume of that is actually, I would say, strong, particularly in areas where pharma is active, like oncology, immunology, cardiometabolic, obesity. And so I think real innovation is still being financed, certainly here in the US and Europe, and also in China. Um, uh, uh, and so that's a great thing. The incremental company, that was financed 3 years ago, that's not getting financed. That's also a good thing because, there is, a line of thinking that there are just too many companies out there, and uh, and uh, and my own view is absolutely, I think there are way too many companies out there, both on the public and private side. And what you're seeing is a Darwinian selection, of haves and have-nots. Haves in the right space with the right product concepts, the right teams, and they're getting the right, sort of capital, to fund those programs. And many have-nots, which for whatever reason don't have those three or four legs of the stool, and they're being ignored. So that Darwinian selection process will continue to happen, continue to
Yeah.
percolate, and I do think that's good for the overall health of the industry.
No, I agree. Yeah, it's almost like normalizing the market. And I look back to like 2020, 2021. You said there was too many public companies as well as private. Like the IPO market was crazy, and you've
Yeah,
actually seen a fair few of those companies fall out because they probably just weren't ready to take that punt, and then
correct.
couldn't survive when it all happened.
That's 100% right. That's what we've seen, and I still think it's working its way through the system.
Yeah.
Uh, we do need a very healthy public market and IPO market, for the overall health of biotech, because as you know, Max, a lot of the like our industry is capital intensive, and we need the capital for the product development. We don't have, like in tech, a very strong late stage private market. That's actually replaced by the public markets, at least historically has been replaced by the public markets. And we have a group of specialist biotech investors who have really financed that, mid to late stage product development on the public side. And historically, we've had, generalist investors who've been active in parts. That generalist investment, pool is has not been active or as active as historically, and so I do think with some of the sort of the macro risk, at least the macro headline risk, abating in the coming 12 months, I do think that pool of capital will come back into the industry, which will be very important, because right now it's the specialist, public market, biotech specialists that are really supporting these IPOs and supporting the follow-ons. But what we're seeing is their support in strength for companies with really good data.
Yeah.
The big takeaway for me, and for our companies, our portfolio, is that companies with good programs and good data, they're being supported, and they will continue to be supported. And that's, I think, a sign of what exactly you want to see, as it pertains to the health of the industry. So.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned it earlier, Vida Ventures just secured their largest fund yet. What are your primary goals for the fund, and how do you plan to leverage it to drive future advancements in biotech?
Definitely. So we closed on our third fund, which is an $825 million fund, in late 2021. And the goal of that fund was to, invest in, groundbreaking, companies, both technology and assets that could, in their indication space, redefine standard of care, and for us at Vida to be very active in those companies, by helping shape their pipeline strategy, in some cases being on their boards, or on their SABs, CABs, and then also in terms of facilitating partnerships, and deal making with pharma. So that those were the goals. Historically, as I mentioned, we've been stage agnostic. We've also been therapeutic area agnostic, but we've
Okay.
focused on a couple of key areas, including oncology, immunology, rare diseases, and increasingly on CNS. And many of the investments we've made in the third fund are in those areas. I would say if there's a way that we see the world scientifically or technically, it's that, we do have a few sort of tenets, of our investment philosophy, and those tenets are as follows. We like to, really, acknowledge, the level of validation of a target, either genetically or clinically.
Hmm.
uh, that increases the probability of success, so we're always looking for targets with some level of validation, genetics, or clinical, or even frankly pathway validation, and going upstream or downstream of the target, depending on the therapeutic window, or the, frankly, the biology of the pathway. So that's one. The second is, being able to, design clinical studies where you can de-risk, said program in 10, 15, 20 patients. um, when you have, what, we would consider a clear signal of clinical activity. So we orientate towards those, those targets and those indications where you can do that, where the sort of the pathophysiology is linear, where there are good, well established biomarkers, biomarkers that are predictive also of relevant, clinical endpoints, or even frankly relevant regulatory endpoints.
Hmm.
Um, uh, and that, really allows you to go after, or really allows you to allocate the large chunks of capital for mid to late stage development with a higher degree of confidence. So that's a second tenet. And the third tenet is more, just acknowledgement of how the industry works, which is, being active in areas where we see increasing farmer M&A activity,
Okay.
um, liquidity in the industry, has and we believe will continue to come from pharma M&A, and so we've been we spend a lot of time trying to understand what and why pharma may do in certain spaces, and where the puck is going, and try to be active in those spaces a priori. So those are the three sort of key tenets of how we've seen the world, how we've always seen the world, quite frankly, and certainly we've expressed that in the deals we've done, the investments we've made.
Yeah, amazing. And then something I'm always so interested to hear about from guys like you is about your mindset, about your decision making, how you deal with pressure and stress. How do you deal with all of that? You know, especially in BC, that must be even heightened.
Yeah, Max, it's interesting. I've always had a sort of a different point of view here. I think, it speaks to my background. So I was a physician. I worked in as a doctor, and so the most stress, the most pressure I ever felt was working as a doctor in certain situations. Um, you know and what I do today, it's very very different to that job. I think when you're working in medicine in a hospital, and you're working in teams, you know uh, the stakes are just so much higher, right? Because you're dealing with human life. Here we're not dealing with human life, we're dealing with investments and companies. And yes, bad things can happen. The probabilities of success are very well established in this industry. So, in any portfolio, you're going to expect one third of these companies to go belly up, to be zeros.
Yeah,
I still think that's just very different to working as a doctor in a hospital, and dealing with human life, right? It's so for me, I that's been my mindset. Is it's a sort of a privilege, and a huge responsibility, to be good here, and for Vida to do a good job. But I've never personally, I haven't felt that stress, because sort of the context that I've had is as a doctor in clinical practice in a hospital, and I just think that's just a different level of stress. Having said that, we are absolutely serious about what we do. At Vida, and we take that, as I mentioned, that responsibility very, very, very seriously. We do have a responsibility, to our LPs, to deliver, the returns that we're focused on, and also, you know, to work with our companies, collaborate with our companies and our co-investors to make the right decisions. That can ultimately lead to medicines that make a difference, to patients globally, and that those are the prisms through which we at Vida see the world.
yeah,
What it also means is that it's never really about me or us at Vida. It's really about working with the team, with our co-investors, with the right structural alignment, and incentives, to get these medicines through development and approved. And if we can do that, then we create a lot of value for everyone, and for the system. So we orientate more towards that, than and making sure those structures are in place, so the right decisions are taken in our companies, and in our portfolio, so we can get the right outcomes, for these companies, which will translate into the right outcomes for the medicines, and the patients that they're looking to impact and serve, which will translate into the right outcomes for our own investors, our own LPs. So I do think it's a unique industry in that if you can thread that needle, you can make all these key stakeholders happy, and that's our motivation. And so we're always focused on what we, not as individuals, or not as a firm, but we as the group at large, in the situations we're in, what we need to do to get there.
yeah. I think that's such an interesting perspective as well. Like you said before on stress, what you did as a doctor was like heightened so much, and the stakes were so much higher that now it's like it really puts it all into perspective. And I had a conversation with someone the other day, and they said, it's best to try and have a monk-like perspective, which is almost a similar thing to what you said, where if a deal falls through or whatever happens, if you actually sit back and go, does that really matter?
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. I
and
agree.
that's when it gets that so much easier. And also, I suppose what you're saying is that if I go and practice as a doctor, and I might not feel stress as much in recruitment in the future. That might not be a good idea for patients, to be
Different.
fair.
It's different. It's I think uh, I have to say, and I have this discussion with my colleagues at Vida, colleagues in the industry. When it's all said and done, when you do take a step back, I think many of us feel very, uh, I would say, energized by what we can what we can do in the positions that we have in this industry, which is really work with with these companies, work with our fellow investors, to create these medicines, and that's a huge privilege, huge responsibility, but it's also tremendous fun, right? So I think many of us, I do think we realize that we have privilege. That's It's a privileged position to be in. So
Yeah, 100%. Look, thanks so much for coming on, Arjun. It's been an absolute pleasure, and really fascinating talk.
excellent. I really appreciate Max. The opportunity to tell our story at Vita, and also affirm that this is just such a unique and wonderful industry, and we want excited people, good people, talented people coming in and making a difference in this industry. So
I agree. I mean, biotech is really not for the faint-hearted, and the people that really make it are the people that are really passionate about what it's all about.
yeah.
Um, so pleasure, Arjun. And look, please like, subscribe to the BioHub. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Take care, Max.
Welcome.